Integrations are the backbone of any great workflow system. And if you're building on ServiceNow, chances are you have spent time writing up REST calls, configuring connection aliases, mapping JSON responses by hand, or maybe even writing scripts just to call an endpoint and parse what comes back. What if AI could do that heavy lifting for you, starting from nothing but an API documentation? The tool is called Spoke Generator, a Now Assist feature inside Workflow Data Fabric. You give it a natural language API documentation, and it will generate a working spoke for you. This video is a walkthrough of a lab I ran at Knowledge 26. I have linked the lab guide down below. If you want to follow along on your own instance, there are some couple extra steps you have to make to prepare your instance. I'll document these as well in the description below. For this lab, we're actually deep in the Star Wars ecosystem, working on the IT team of the Rebel Alliance. We have got this fancy portal, the Rebel Alliance Control Tower, and we need to feed it with data from the Galactic Intelligence API, a galaxy-wide database. The goal is to have actual personal data in ServiceNow and link them to the Starships they have flown. As you can see here right now, the personal list is empty. By the end of this video, we want to have a full set of characters linked all to their ships. Let's build that. Before we get started, let's make sure the Spoke Generator skill is already active on that instance. For this, we're going to head over to the Now Assist admin homepage, navigate to Skills, go down to Creator, and search for Spoke Generator. On my instance, it's already active. In case it's not on yours, run the activation part. Any default values on it will be fine. Once that's active, we can start working. For this one, we go to Workflow Studio. Workflow Studio is used for anything with flows, actions, subflows, but also integrations. Now to create a new spoke, we're going to click on New, select Spoke, and it will ask us for a name of this new spoke. So let's call it Galactic Intelligence Spoke. And I'm going to use description name the same for the sake of this demo. Let's click on Continue. And this creates the scope and loads the Spoke Generator. Now, if you have created integrations before, you might have used OpenAI or Postman, which is great if you have this type of specification from your third-party system. Now, in this case, I want to show you how you can do it if you don't have that. So let's use Now Assist and continue. If you have worked with any of our Now Assist products before, you know this kind of wizard-style interface. And the first thing we need is a prompt to tell Now Assist what we want to do. So I've prepared a prompt here. You see that in the lab guide that's linked below, which is more or less a natural description of what the API does. Let's click Generate a Preview, and Now Assist will work with that information. Now Assist figured out what the path is, what the method is, what the headers are, figured also out what the output variables are. So it found all that information that we need to generate the action. It reports here that input variables are missing, but that's okay for this particular action because we don't have an input. It's just getting information from the API. So for this is great. We will work another example later on where we actually have an input variable. Well, let's continue. Next step is we need some credentials for an API. Every API needs credentials, with the exception of the one that we use here. So what we need to do is we create a credential, but it doesn't really matter what kind of password or authentication key we use because this API doesn't need any credential. We still need to populate something. So let's create a new. So on this screen, we need to configure the basic URL for our API. Again, that's in the lab guide below. If you want to test it out, swappy py4e is where we take that. And we need any API key. Just put in a couple of letters. Again, for this particular API, it doesn't matter. Let's submit that. We are ready to publish the first action. So let's just do that. Publish. As Now Assist kicks in to build the action, we see this confirmation dialog. And it tells us that generating the action might take a few moments, but we can look at the spoke page and see what's happening. In my case, it's already published. If you're fast in clicking, you might see it under drafts until it comes over to the published ones. We also see the notification bar saying that this action was generated by Now Assist, and we should check it for accuracy. So let's run exactly that, a test. Let's open the Get People action. Now Assist generated this Open API step. You can see it uses the alias, it uses the API source, the API operation. So it has mapped everything that we need to map, and we can straight from here run a test on that call, execute this one, and validate the results of it. We scroll down to the action of Get All People. We can see that the output here already has information. You can see that we get information, for example, like Luke Skywalker, just what we need. And there's a whole bunch of other folks in that call. That was very easy to build a first action and integrate with a third-party system that we didn't have any specification around it, right? So the action has been generated, we tested it, it returns information about personal. Let's embed this action into a flow that we can persist the information onto the ServiceNow database. We create a new flow. We could generate the flow again with Now Assist, but in this case I want to build it on my own. I'll give it a name, Rebel Personal Daily Sync, because we want to synchronize that information once a day. It doesn't change that frequently. We have the new flow. Let's add a trigger and put it on scheduled daily. Let's say at 22 hours or 10 p.m. And that's our flow trigger. Now as activity, we go into action and we search the newly generated action, Get All People. We can find this one under Galactic Intelligence. That's our spoke name. And there's Get All People. This action doesn't take any inputs, so there's nothing to do. Let's close that. But it does generate outputs. So we can see that we have here the results as an array.object. So it's an array. Let's loop this array so we can do something with all the personal we get back. And now for each item, we actually have to put in another action. As part of the lab preparation, I prepared an action that stores the information. This action is called create or update person. You can see that it's part of the Rebel Alliance Control Tower. That's great. Let's use that one. And it uses a JSON object of the person. That's just what you get from the API. So I prepared that for us so it's easier to use. Click on Done. And this should be our daily sync. We can run a test to verify. Test completed. Let's look at the execution of our flow. And we can already see that this flow has processed 10 records. So for each of them, we could see details. Again, here's the JSON of the person. And I wonder the first one is again, Luke Skywalker has been processed. And we see that all was successful. We can hop over back to the portal. As you can see, we already have 10 people here in the Alliance personal roster with, for example, Luke Skywalker in here. This was exercise 1 of my lab. Now for exercise 2, I promise you we will put in a little more effort. The action we created in the first exercise doesn't take any inputs. Now we want to have an input. On our portal, if I open the details of any of the personal roster, we have a button called refresh, which would trigger an immediate refresh of that person. For this one, we need to pass in the ID of the current person into the API. But this is a different API. So let's create a new action in Workflow Studio. I'll clear out a few tabs just to make room for the new activity. To add an action into an existing spoke, let's hop over to integrations and search our newly generated Galactic Intelligence API. And from here on, we can say create action, and we can use same like before, Now Assist. Just a little different prompt this time, and let's generate a preview. And I can see the difference here is that in the resource path, it uses a data build called action ID, and we have actually the ID as input variable. So Now Assist was smart enough to pick up that ID and prepare everything for us. Awesome. Let's generate the action. We just use the same credential as before and publish it. Go to the spokes page. We can find the action on the published like before. Let's open it and investigate what it generated. This is the new action, get person by ID, and you can see it has an input of ID. And if I look in the OpenAPI step, we can actually see it's using the ID here as the step inputs. Let's give it a test. We're going to use the ID 1, which I know from testing this is Luke Skywalker. Let's view the results. And again, we can scroll down to the output and we can see this is Luke Skywalker and only Luke Skywalker at this point. Similar like before, we need to embed that into a flow so it can be called by our portal. Close a few tabs and let's generate a new subflow in this case because we need the ID as an input to pass on to our action. Again, we'll use build our own and we call it Rebel Personal Lookup as we are looking up one particular person. Let's create first the input. We call that variable a person ID. And we keep it as a string, which is fine, but we set it as mandatory because without that ID, the whole subflow doesn't make any sense. Now let's add the action, same like before. We use the one that has generated, get person by ID. This time we can see the input showing up here. So we use the person ID, drop it in here and use that. Again, like before, we have the output. We need to update our record. So we will again use the same action as before. Create update person. This time we don't need a loop because it's only one user we're getting back. We can basically take the output, the whole object, and drop that in here for the create update person. We can run a test on this one to make sure everything works using the person ID and execute. Execution is complete. Get inside and we can see that the create or update person was triggered. And if we go down here, we can see again Luke Skywalker's data passed into the create or update person action. Our flow works. So let's publish that flow so we can use it in the portal. So here's the portal. For example, I'm going to use Beru. Click on refresh person. You can see it's spinning around, taking a few seconds, and it should refresh the data of Beru. Now that refresh didn't show any new data, obviously, as nothing has changed for Beru, but let's trust that it worked in the backend. This was basically exercise 2. There is a challenge version of that would actually enable this search. So you type in one of the names. Right now it searches only locally onto the ServiceNow database, but it would also trigger a search into the Galactic API if the flow behind that has been configured accordingly. I'm going to skip that for the purpose of this video. Let's hop on to exercise number 3. By now we have created 2 different actions. Get a list of personnel and get one person in particular. This is great, but what we also need is to link that information of the persons to the fleet, the starships they have been on. This information is currently not being handled in our flows, so let's add that. So in Workflow Studio, we use the flow that we just generated, Rebel Personal Lookup, and add information. We know, for example, that the output we get from the call getPersonById also includes an array of strings, in that case, of starships. We get a starship object. All we need to do is parse this array and link it to the appropriate record in ServiceNow. Idea behind this exercise is to show how we can build the loop in the loop if we need to, and how we can take an ID, because this one is basically only the ID of the starship, find the appropriate ID in ServiceNow and link the 2 records together. So let's go through that step by step. After we updated the person, let's put in another logic to loop the starships, because one person might have served on multiple ships, right? And close that. Now that we know which starship, we need to look up the record in ServiceNow with the ID we get from the external system. For this one, we use an action that I have prepared. That's one called lookup starship. That lookup requires an ID. What we do get from the API is a URL that includes the ID. I'll show that in the test data in just a second again. So what we need to do here is adding a little script in here. The lab guide has the script included, so we can just copy and paste it in here. Essentially what we'll be doing is from the URL we're getting, we are removing every part that we don't need using a regular expression, replace content, and just find the idea that we need. So now that we have looked up the starship, we get back the starship sysID, so we know which one it is. All we need to do is create the reference between the starship and the person. For this one, also my lab prepared an action, create or update crew entry, where we can link the 2 together. We need the person sysID and the starship sysID. So the create or update person delivers the person ID, and the lookup starship returns the starship sysID. Close that one, and we can run a first test. I'm gonna use again Luke, because we know he was at least on one starship, right? Execution completed. Let's check the details. First part, get person by ID. We looked at that before, but I wanted to show the starship array again. Now we can see what we get from the API is actually a URL to the starship. And the interesting part that we need is that they enter the 12 or the 22, which is the unique identifier of the starship that we need to link to Luke. Now we use that one to look up a starship. In the array, you can see the loop goes 2 records. That's the 2 we have seen. And we get back a starship sysID. And we create a record into the crew entry with 2 records. So we actually can go back to the portal and we should see Luke's starships now. So here's the portal. Let's go down to Luke, open it one. And here we can see Luke was on an X-Wing, obviously, and he was on an Imperial shuttle. We have updated and linked Luke to another starship. Let's try Obi-Wan Kenobi. Obi-Wan was on a hell bunch of different ships. That was exercise number 3. Now the last exercise is filling a gap that we created in exercise 1. I particularly didn't explain that yet, but we see that there's only 10 people of the Alliance being recorded here right now. Obviously, there are way more people in the Galactic than these 10. Why did that happen? That is because the API we use, getAllPeople, will only return 10 people per each call. So what we need to do is add a pagination and loop through all of the pages to get more records. That will teach us another concept of integrations, how to store a variable and loop until there are no more records. For this, let's go back to Workflow Studio. Now in Workflow Studio, the first thing we need to change is the action itself, get all people. You might remember it doesn't take any input right now, but it will need an input now so we can tell him which page we want to return from the API. So for this one, let's start creating an input. I'll call it page as that is the typical name we use for these kind of integrations. I'm going to expand the input and set the default value here of 1. So if no input is given, we want to have the first page. Now having that page, let's move into this step with Open the API, because we need to give that page information also to the API. For this one, we'll activate the advanced view. We can see the whole resource path and other information. Based on the API definition that we know, all we need to do is basically put here a question mark and say page equals and add our variable. Here we go. Now that will pass in the page information from the input into the resource path, allowing us to get different pages. Let's run a test. You remember the default of 1, and we know that the first user we got back was Luke. So let's straight go into page 2 and see who we get. And checking the results, and we can go down to the outputs, and we can see the first one coming back is now Anakin Skywalker. And we also get an information that the next page would actually be page number 3. So we have successfully updated our action to use a page parameter and passed it on to the API. Let's publish that so we can use that again in our flow. The publish feature will now tell us which flow it's actually using. That's Rebel Personal Data Sync. Publish. Time to update our flow and use the page parameter. So let's open the flow that we generated earlier, our daily sync. Now what we need to do is we need to build another loop around the whole process here, getting multiple pages and processing each page by page. To keep track of where we are, we need a variable on which page we are currently on. So we go to flow variables. In this case, create a new variable. I call it next page. Keep it as a string. Now, as a first step in the beginning, we'll need to set this variable to 1 as we're going to start with the first page, right? So under flow logic, you can find the action set flow variables. We add our next page and set it to 1. And now we need to pass in that information into the get all people. So let's open get all people. You can see there it has now the page parameter defaulted to 1. We don't want to have the default. We're going to use our variable to put that in. Again, and click on done. Now we're still doing just one page. We still need to add the loop around that. To do so, we put a loop right in between here and say we're gonna do a loop in this case, do the following until, because we want to run until it's done. So as a condition, I say next page is empty. So if we don't get any new next page information, so we're gonna use our next page variable here and say is empty. Let's close out this input selector here, and we can start dragging the content of the loop into the loop. So now what we still need to do is basically after the get all people, extract the next page so we know to continue. For this one, we add another flow logic in here. Again, we set a flow variable. We use our next page. And in this case, I'm going to use another little script to extract the information. The information is already part of our output. If you're down here, you can see there is the next, which is the URL. And again, the script, what it does is basically just splitting everything off until page equals so we know what's the next page. With that done, we can actually run the test and see what happens. Execution completed. Let's open the details. And you can see that it actually processed 9 pages with roughly 10 each. The last one probably didn't have 10 records, but it did process as we wanted it to. Let's have a look at our portal, how many records we actually got. And here we are, the portal is refreshed and we can see 87 Alliance personals. So you get the whole list, and for each of them, we can open up details. And if we would want, we can refresh them to see their Starships, because our daily sync currently does not link the Starships. This was the last exercise. So with all 4 exercises completed, quick recap, what did we actually build? We started from nothing but a page of API documentation. Plain text, plain English, no specific format. And from that on, we generated working spoke actions. With multiple actions, we wired that into flows and subflows, built it out into a portal, including an on-demand refresh, and all done with a lot of help of Now Assist. So within a few minutes, actually, we created that working spoke. That's pretty amazing. There are a couple of things I want you to take away. First one, spoke generator works from plain documents. You don't need a specific OpenAPI, Postman collection or something like that. Just copy and paste from a web page, from a PDF file, whatever, drop it in the Spoke generator, and it will start doing its magic. Second, these generated actions are just first-class citizen for Workflow Data Fabric. They are proper actions. They use credentials and aliases, not scripted. It's all low code. They slot straight into the flows and subflows like anything else there. And last one, the AI scaffolds. It doesn't do the whole 9 yards. You need to tune it, add things like maybe pagination, some little tricks and scripts to identify IDs and relations and things like that. They're still up to you, so it doesn't take away all the work, but it does do the heavy lifting for you. That's it for today's video. If you find this was useful, subscribe to my Now Bytes for more practitioner level ServiceNow content. And if you're planning to run this on your own instance, again, check down the description. You'll find the lab guide and the extra steps you need to do to run that lab on your environment. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.